the World Bank is the best known, but does happen to be part of the UN system. But there are others. The Asian Development Bank is also a development bank, but it is not formally a part of the UN system. Similarly with the African Development Bank, similarly with the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. There's the Latin American Bank and so on, the IADB. So the multilateral development banks are very much at the core of what we call the multilateral system. Now, naturally, that being so, and given the size of these banks, they are the ones who lend money to developing countries for all sorts of projects. Their influence on those countries is huge because they are the ones having been in the position of lending large sums of money. They are the ones who then design projects which last for 5, 10, and even more than 10 years. And these have direct impacts not only on the lives of tens of millions of people around the world, but they also have a lasting impact on how the countries frame their own laws and regulations. You can imagine that, let's say, a development program in Sri Lanka on renewing or clearing up the water systems, that means the riverine basins. If the Asian Development Bank is involved, there will be a few agencies who will actually carry out the work, maybe 4 or 5. For each of those, there would be 10 to a dozen other agencies which are doing the monitoring and evaluation. So you have an enormous system which is working simultaneously in different geographies. This, especially over the last 15 years, has led to a proliferation of organizations, university-based centers, advocacy groups, voluntary groups, project-specific groups that have sprung up all over the world, often in Western countries, in partnership with similar organizations in our countries, India, of course, included. These then form a kind of second tier of non-core multilateralism, which has a great impact on the way the ordinary public, the working class salaried public, comes to see both the ML system, that is the multilaterals, and the United Nations system as an overall governing framework together.
Namaste, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Indic Talks organized by Center for Indic Studies. In this session, we have Rahul Goswami ji, a UNESCO expert in Asia on living heritage for 13 years now. Through his advisory roles on environment and agriculture, he has been associated with the programs of UN agencies such as FAO, UNDP, UNFCCC, and UNICEF. And from what I've gathered, from our past interactions during a conference in Gurgaon, he's an ardent environmentalist as well as a journalist. Our speaker today will discuss the orientation on the international bodies and their programs, chiefly those of the United Nations and the multilateral agencies, with an examination of their impacts on sovereign countries such as India. This lecture aims to forearm young Indians about the intentions and methods of the UN and the multilateral system, and to provide a grounding to those interested in critically understanding the system through our talk today titled Unpacking Global Governance, What Young People Need to Know. I welcome you, sir, and I request you to take over from here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ojasvi. I hope I'm clear enough and you can all hear me. Good. I must say I'm very happy that Indus University and your center is hosting this what I would call a rather unconventional lecture. But if you don't do unconventional things, then nobody's going to learn anything. So thanks again, and my thanks also to Tanya Franz, with whom earlier in the year I had a number of exchanges, and which has led to this. And just for those who are listening, both Tanya and Ojasvi were participants at the gathering that Ojasvi just mentioned, where I explained at length the subject. Anyway, let's stick to the format. What I will do is give you an introduction to this lecture, why we are having it in the first place, for about 10 minutes, followed by 20 minutes of my experience with UN agencies. Then Ojasvi will show you a short selection of images which will help either reinforce what I've said or introduce you, or rather guide you into ways of thinking about the UN and multilateral system, followed by 20 minutes of the implications of what I witnessed and learned. And then we move to the Q&A. So why are we having this lecture on a subject that has probably a very arcane title? The UN, that is the United Nations, and the multilateral system, and its impact and implications on our country and what we do in any of these areas. To go back to where it started from, I would have to say that in a way it goes to 2006, as long ago as that. Perhaps some of you, the younger among you, may not have encountered this, but some of you would have heard of a program which was called the Millennium Development Goals, which was launched by the United Nations in the year 2000. And this set out 8 goals for the developing countries of the world. And these were in the usual areas that you would expect the UN to work in: water and sanitation, population, hunger, environment, adequate food, good quality education, and so forth. You can look it up. I would say the signal difference between what the UN had done prior to that and what it began to do then is that it grouped the entire developing world as its constituency for a single overarching program that came to be called the Millennium Development Goals. And this was, for the first time, something that had been attempted by the UN system on this scale and with this focus. There's no doubt that in earlier years, in earlier decades, in fact, there were all sorts of programs relating to, especially to health, to education, excuse me, and so on. But here we had a package of 8 sectors to which countries were expected to sign up. They did, in fact, in September 2000, and which committed them to a course of action which would last until 2015. Now, this, from my background, my own background, as Ojasvi had mentioned, which included a substantial stint as a journalist, that was quite long ago, but also considerable work on rural development and environmental issues. To me, this sounded, yes, full of good intentions, but how exactly was it going to work, and why was it packaged this way? Certainly, my generation was trained to look at things quite critically. Who is telling you what, for what reasons, with what intentions, and what motives? And by 2004, I became part of a small group which started examining this, because what we started seeing is that ministry and program budgets in our government were beginning to allocate money to the MDGs. And I thought they deserved this allocation, and this work deserved closer scrutiny. By 2006, the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation was already reporting about how the MDGs were being implemented in the various sectors in India. And the question that occurred to me was, who are you reporting to? Because this is not part of our union budget, sectoral allocation. This is not part of our state budget. So who are you reporting to? And I did a couple of analytical pieces about it, analytical pieces of writing about it. And yes, well, so that's where it starts from. My direct exposure to the UN agencies began in 2005 through an advisory post I began to hold at that time with the Center for Environment Education, Himalaya. The UN agencies in question were UNICEF, because of the Education for Sustainable Development program, which was a very big, very well-funded, very powerfully promoted program, which ran for a long time and continues to run, in fact, and UNDP, which then took over the the development-related parts of that program. So these were the two agencies. Following that, through a tenureship I had as a consultant to a Ministry of Agriculture program, which ran from 2009 to 2013, I worked with the FAO, Committee on Food Security, which is a worldwide committee. This is one of the main things that FAO does, and got to understand this very important sector, both in the UN and in all sorts of countries, developing, developed, and of food and agriculture, the trading of commodities, food commodities, the retail sector, biotechnology, genetic engineering, and so on. And was able to look at, because I became part of the international consultative group, which then gives in inputs and advice to the Committee on Food Security. I was able to then see the influences at work, especially from industry, from research, and from academia. I'm making a distinction here between research and academia, and you'll understand why, which then shape policy. And this, together with the subsequent experience I had directly with UNESCO and through UNESCO with a number of UN agencies, because we worked on programs together, I began, especially by around 2016, to realize that all this needs to have a concerted examination being done upon it to better, to not to, yes, to better understand, but also to better uncover the ways in which our own policies, laws, and approaches to all these subjects is in fact influenced by external agents. And I'm saying this quite bluntly because that is exactly how I saw it. And this is, in a way, the background to this lecture. As a delivery of this experience and these insights, the lectures really began last year when I did a program with hosted by the Sarayu Trust of Delhi and organized by Brihat, which explained this over a much longer time frame of 3 days. Even 3 days, in fact, I found it felt short of what we should do. But this is just to give you an outline as to why we're having this lecture in the first place. So I think that takes care of the first 10 minutes. I'd like to move on now to specifics about my experiences with the UN agencies, and I'll try my best to squeeze in two examples. Now, when we think of the UN, and I have to just stop a bit and say, since I'm the title of this lecture is UN and Multilaterals. What do we mean by multilaterals? So multilaterals are agencies and organizations that work in the international sphere, very often, if not inevitably, in partnership with the UN, but they're not formally part of the UN system. So the UN system has a number of agencies, departments, and associated offices, but the multilaterals are not part of that. So if you ask what then is a multilateral, my first answer would be that very conspicuously, the multilaterals are what are called the global development banks. For example, the World Bank is the best known, but does happen to be part of the UN system. But there are others. The Asian Development Bank is also a development bank, but it is not formally a part of the UN system. Similarly with the African Development Bank, similarly with the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. There's the Latin American Bank and so on, the IADB. So the multilateral development banks are very much at the core of what we call the multilateral system. Now, naturally, that being so, and given the size of these banks, they are the ones who lend money to developing countries for all sorts of projects. Excuse me. Their influence on those countries is huge. Because they are the ones having been in the position of lending large sums of money, they are the ones who then design projects which last for 5, 10, and even more than 10 years. And these have direct impacts not only on the lives of tens of millions of people around the world, but they also have a lasting impact on how the countries frame their own laws and regulations. And I'll come back to this point a little later in this lecture because it's an extremely important point, and I'd like you to give it the thought that it requires. So the multilateral development banks are very much at the core of what we call the multilateral part of this system. Because they are so large and because they operate in so many fields, and because also a lot of this work has to do with engineering, construction relating to infrastructure, they work with the private sector and private agencies. And that means corporations. And where there is corporations, there needs to be oversight. Where there is corporations, there also needs to be the application of standards. And you can imagine that in the oversight, and this is technical or scientific oversight, but also social sector oversight, what we call social sector impact. And that being so, for every project, there are dozens and dozens of other agencies which are doing either monitoring, evaluation under these two heads. A lot of this is given to external agencies, monitoring, evaluation, and the social sector impacts, and in fact, the general grading of the quality of work and the integrity of what are supposed to be the outcomes. So you can imagine that, let's say, a development program in Sri Lanka on renewing or clearing up the water systems, that means the riverine basins. If the Asian Development Bank is involved, there will be a few agencies who will actually carry out the work, maybe 4 or 5. For each of those, there would be 10 to a dozen other agencies which are doing the monitoring and evaluation. So you have an enormous system which is working simultaneously in different geographies on a range of subjects. The multilateral system also includes a great deal of advocacy work. So this is advocacy in what we call the social sectors. These are, I'm sure you can name them off the fingers of your hand. These have to do with, what is often today, these days, linked to the rights and empowerment ideas. So these certainly have to do with education, quality of education, women's rights, women's empowerment, increasingly now child rights, the question of gender, the question of what are called the castes and tribes, uh, marginalized people, indigenous people, and so on. In a word, the non-technical, non-infrastructural parts of what is the whole compound of international development. Needless to add, because I'm sure if you're attending this lecture, you have already considerable exposure to what has been going on. So needless to add, this, especially over the last 15 years, has led to a proliferation of organizations, university-based centers, advocacy groups, voluntary groups, project-specific groups that have sprung up all over the world, often in Western countries, in partnership with similar organizations in our countries, India, of course, included. And these then form a kind of second tier of non-core multilateralism, which has a great impact on the way the ordinary public, the working class salaried public, comes to see both the ML system, that is the multilaterals, and the United Nations system as an overall governing framework together. And if you look back at the kind of press and media coverage that is generated for and by this system together, United Nations and the multilaterals, then you will find overwhelmingly that it is presented as a force for good, as a force for what is called social justice, as a force for equity, for environmental protection, for, excuse me, for farmers' rights, for the equal distribution of wealth, and so on. The provision of education to the previously unlettered, and so on. This is in fact the overall image that you will see from thousands upon thousands of media sources, not just articles, video clips, and TV shows, but thousands upon thousands of media sources, that is individual newspapers, TV channels, and so on in every single country. So we're talking about an enormous image creation and image building system that pushes the idea of global governance through these two fronts, the United Nations system and the multilateral system, working together, but if not together, and often in partnership, in order to sensitize you as a citizen of India to the notion that, yes, you have your municipal governance if you live in a city, you have your state government, you have your central government, you have your so-called organs of democratic institution, you have your oversights and so on. But in your mind is created this rather nebulous idea that arching above all this, and I'm stressing on the word above, arching above all this is a vast network of do-gooders who have abundant experience, superior experience, superior knowledge, and access to advanced technology, access to advanced methods of applying that technology and the creators of advanced concepts. This is, in fact, what you have been subjected to as a young adult or as an older adult. I don't know whether whichever you fall into. This is what you have been subjected to as the idea of global governance. And I stress also that the idea, because it is meant to be a live idea in your mind, and that live idea is meant also to subordinate the idea of central, state, provincial, and local governance in your mind. Now, you may say that, look, these are pretty strong statements to make, and on what basis can I make them? And in fact, that basis will follow certainly in the last 20 minutes. Excuse me. So this is I would say the summary of my ruminations about what I've seen with UN agencies. There have been quite a few. As Ojasvi mentioned earlier, 13 years until end of 2023 with UNESCO, that is UNESCO, both Asia and headquarters, separately with FAO, separately with UNICEF, also together with UNICEF, with FAO, with UNDP, with UNFCCC, with WHO, on various aspects of various projects that I have come to be involved with during the last 20 odd years. Um, my focus in general has been traditional knowledge systems, and the ways in which they are documented, safeguarded, and used to benefit. And in this connection, therefore, I've had to deal with a number of these agencies. Excuse me. And in that dealing, or rather through that dealing, I've in general come to understand not only the mind of an agency, but the mind of the system behind that agency, or rather the mind of the system of which that agency is a part. And there is certainly a lot of commonality in the way that these agencies design their approach, and more important, design their approach to any subject, and more important, design the ways in which they interact with the host government. For example, so let's say if UNICEF is running a program in Jharkhand, it will work with the state government of Jharkhand in a particular way, but it will also work to have that project pushed through in the manner of its liking with the Ministry of Education. And this is something that I will explain a little more in the second part. So when we talk about really the sectoral significance of any UN agency or multilateral agency, that is a foreign organization which is gathering, or rather which claims as its authority its ability to gather best practices from around the world, distill them to your advantage. By your advantage, I mean a local Indian advantage. By local Indian, it means that they always talk only to administrations. So to the advantage of the administration in fulfilling its, that is the administration's own goals in development and programs. So what we have then, please think about what I said. The agency, the international agency, promises the gathering and delivering of global best practices to fulfill a local need, a local administrative need and goal, or local administrative need and mission. And as I said earlier, it was around the period of 2015, 16, 17 that I began to see in earnest what this actually meant on the ground. Because, and why 16 is important is because, as I said earlier, 2015 is when the Millennium Development Goals concluded. 2016, the UN General Assembly agreed on the format and the number and the initial rollout of what became the Sustainable Development Goals. And the difference between the two, of course, is that the SDGs, as they came to be known, was a much bigger program. It was aimed at all the UN countries, not just the developing countries, but all of them. And many more. The MDGs had 8 goals. The SDGs have 17, as you well know. And the SDGs have a much bigger, a vast bureaucracy that surrounds them, which extends far beyond the United Nations and the multilateral system. And as I said, 2006 is when I first began to see our central ministries start formatting their reporting according to what the MDGs were doing. With the SDGs, it has been much faster and on a much wider scale. Every single ministry now, I don't think there are even a handful which have escaped this. Every single ministry now has reporting according to what the SDG formats are demanding. Moreover, our Central Planning Authority, which during the MDG times was the Planning Commission, and for the last 8 years has been Niti Aayog, our Central Planning Authority also invests a lot on the implementation of the SDGs. So this is, in short, the part about why my experience with the UN agencies has led to this kind of inquiry. I'm almost at the end of this 20-minute segment, so I'll give you one example. I don't think I'll have time for two. And I'll use the example of the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the UN, which has a lot to do with, I mean, you would be completely justified in asking, so what does the FAO do? What it does is primarily, it was, in fact, that's the reason it was set up. It was to do two things. One is to tackle wherever chronic hunger occurs in the world, and to be able to forecast and plan and deal with emerging hunger hotspots, as you would call them today, or zones of incidents of hunger, famine, and malnutrition, wherever they break out in the world, or wherever they have tended to break out in the world, and find ways of mitigating those impacts. In the course of this mission, FAO has come to do many things, including, of course, support the development of hybrid crops and cropping systems, which in many cases have proven to be totally unsuitable to the areas in which they're rolled out. If there had been, and in fact there was, if you go back to some of the critical writing about the Green Revolution, which was implemented in India in the 60s and which continued until the 70s, you will see that FAO certainly had a role to play. FAO was very much alive and kicking even then. FAO had a role to play. The impact of the FAO's thinking is that because we want to reduce hunger and we want to eradicate famine and malnutrition, we will go for the best possible technical and industrial solution. Now, it isn't at all the way agroecological systems work. on which I have done a lot of study, fieldwork, and recommendation at every possible level, right from the FAO Committee on Food Security to, in fact, the 11th and 12th 5-year plans. The 12th was the last one that we had. And so, whereas FAO, again, like a smaller mirror of the United Nations system, whereas FAO is
Yes, sir.
able to say and prove that it can gather the best technical expertise on food and agriculture and find ways to implement it wherever in the world you are, whatever your geography. The point is that there already exists in that geography and in traditional knowledge ways of cultivation which the FAO does not take cognizance of. As a result of continuing criticism, it was in the late 90s or mid 90s that FAO started a cell which was called, which had to do with agricultural heritage, in order to show the world that yes, it has paid some attention to this. Did somebody say something? No. Okay. So this is by way of one example. I apologize for the very brief way in which I've had to give you this example. Normally, I would like to take, an hour on two examples, but we just don't have the time in this very, very abbreviated lecture. But this fundamentally, I think, is, if you ask, why is somebody like you explaining a subject like this? Is it a subject at all? Yes, it is, because the question of the oversight and the monitoring and evaluation of the UN itself and its associated multilateral agencies is something that desperately needs to be done in an organized way. I'm certainly not an organized way of doing it, but I do have the experience and the sequence of events to be able to contribute to it, which is what I'm trying to do through these lectures, like the one last year, this one, and the ones to follow during the course of this year. Right. So this is as far as the second section goes, my experience with the UN agencies. I haven't, unfortunately, been able to tell you enough about the UNESCO part of it. Maybe I'll tell you in the next session. So we'll take a short deviation from my speaking here, because I'd like to be able to show you a few images. Ojasvi, if you're there, can we start off with the images? Okay, wonderful. So let's start from the first one. Yeah. All right. So I'll very quickly go through this. Just try and retain the subliminal image in your mind, so that it forms some kind of collage later on. Article in The Economist, Corruption at the Heart of the United Nations. I think that was 2005. This had to do with the famous oil for food program in Iraq. And if you read up about that, you're in for a shocker. Next one, please. Commentary in an American newspaper about the oil for food program. That was one of the biggest scandals ever to involve the United Nations. It had to do with an astonishing cynicism, whereby, in fact, as this article quite correctly says, the result of the oil for food program was the Iraqi people became even more dependent on Hussein, meaning Saddam Hussein, a tyrant whom the UN was helping to fund. I think that says quite a bit. Next one. This is a communication, in fact, on this platform, LinkedIn. This is a communication with somebody who is critical of the UN. The keywords here are politics of oversight and accountability, the whether there is in fact transparency and accountability. And this is exceptionally important because of the impact and influence UN and multilateral programs have in India, and the ways in which our ministries, central ministries, but including now state governments who are partnering with multilateral agencies. Where is the accountability and oversight? I think it's mostly opaque. It is kept opaque unless it is demanded. And this really goes back quite a long way. So again, look at that sentence there. The terrible irony is that the primary public international organization dedicated to the deterrence of corruption and human suffering that it causes has itself been significantly undermined by that same corruption. So, corruption is a charge that has consistently dogged the UN and the multilateral agencies, simply because of the enormous sums of money that are mobilized for these programs. Where is the oversight? I mean, did you know that, for example, the WHO, one of the auditing agencies uh, which goes through the WHO programs and accounts is our own Comptroller and Auditor General, our own CAG. And consistently, what the CAG points out are lapses every single year is ignored by the WHO and the WHO General Assembly, of which India is a constituent part. So when it comes to corruption, or when it comes to, let's say, mendacity uh, of a UN and multilateral agency, and the representatives, the country representatives who are supposed to demand this, there seems to be no limit. Next one, please. Here, this is just to show you the way in which the multilateral agencies and the UN agencies combine on programs. This, in fact, is IPC is one of the cells of the FAO. IPC stands for International Phase Classification, which has to do with the degree of hunger or expected hunger, threatened hunger, famine, malnutrition, and so on. It's a somewhat technical classification, but here are the agencies which work with it. And you can see, for example, some of them: Oxfam, CARE, USAID, UK Aid, IDRC of Canada, Save the Children, two European Union agencies, and so on. You can see the coming together of the UN and multilateral system. Next one, please. This is from the roster of what are called the UN Special Rapporteurs. So the UN has, under the HCR, the Office of the Human Rights Commission. They have this, probably, if I'm not wrong, it's almost 60, somewhere about around 60, what are called special rapporteurs. They're supposed to be independent, and they are meant to study, interview, go on the ground, record their impressions of any particular problem or sector. It is a system which is completely opaque and which has come under a lot of fire, because this is the equivalent of, in fact, saying that we are not only agency driven, that is, not only our employees and our consultants do the work. We have outside specialists working in our framework who are subject and domain experts, and they provide an unbiased and objective view. In most cases, this can be challenged. In several cases, this has been completely overturned. And I would like you to look at the third name on that list: Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights in the Palestinian Territory Occupied since 1967. And this, again, is in the context of the ongoing conflict which began in early October 2023 between the State of Israel and the terrorist organization Hamas. And that particular person in that row over there has been exposed in the last 2 to 3 months as being a PLO and a Hamas sympathizer. And yet, as she occupies and continues to occupy the office of being the special rapporteur under this UN system. Next, please. And because of these gross distortions in their methods, excuse me, because of these gross distortions in their methods, the UN has come under, of course, all sorts of criticism, including lampooning like this. This is about the International Court of Justice, which again is part of the UN system. It has to do really with the the ludicrousness of not being able to rule in opposition to what terrorist activities do. Again, this is not only in connection with the conflict in the Middle East, but the recent conflict in the Middle East, but it also goes back quite a long way, because none of the abominations that has accompanied any of these conflicts, for example, the Yazidis of more than a decade ago, excuse me, that has still not found adequate voice in the UN system. Next, please. And so we have this continuing lampooning now. The famous blue helmets, that is also referred to as the UN Army. And I'm sure many of you would know that our Indian Army supplies troops who are seconded to the UN peacekeeping forces wherever they may be operating. And it would be a shame if this is what they are seen as. Next, please. A more interesting image is this one of the weaponization of radical ideas, especially of students in Western campuses, who in the last 7 months have become violent proponents of the so-called Palestinian liberation and resistance organizations, which are nothing but terror groups, but who nevertheless have been emboldened to do all that they have done with no censure, but in fact quite the opposite. The supporting of their so-called rights to free speech by doing this. And this is one of the more insidious parts of what the UN agency's concerted program to push the ideas of radicalism, couched and surrounded by a lot of the apparatus of free speech, gender, LGBT, and so on. This I find one of the most dangerous weapons in that armory, because of its ability to radicalize young students who really should be spending their university time much more productively. Next, please, or is that the end? Oh, that's true. Yes, yes. And just to show you, or rather just to explain to you, to help explain to you, one of the motivations I had in doing a lecture like this and its previous iterations was to show you the number of young Indians who are increasingly drawn to the UN system, either knowing what it stands for and not really caring about its impacts on themselves, or being ignorant of what it stands for and being starry-eyed about this whole international label and this international cachet that they would be associated with. I'm a UN consultant, or I'm a UN intern, or whatever it is. So, especially in the last, certainly since 2017, when the SDGs began to be more visible, when began to become more visible in our own systems of governance. Every single ministry started having an SDG cell and so on. Younger people were starstruck by this idea that they could be part of a big, visible, powerful international system, and therefore started signing up first to be interns, and then in the hope of getting permanent positions, either with a UN agency or with an NGO or an advocacy groups that works closely with a UN agency. Next, please. And some more of the same you can see from their descriptions, the kinds of sectors and the jobs that they hold. So I'll quickly try and run through the implications of what I've seen and learned. Going back to the FAO example I gave you earlier, at the time I was engaged with a small group of economists. So this came very closely after the 2008 what is called the Asian financial crisis, and that caused quite a bit of turmoil in the food commodity markets. And one of the things that the FAO does is it maintains the FAO Food Price Index. So this is a global index of food prices under broad headings of cereals and oils and so on. It's although I used to follow it very closely at one time, and every half a point here and there, I would try and do some commentary about it. I then realized during the course of time that in fact the FAO Food Price Index was heavily influenced by the role of the world's largest food commodity traders, who maintain their own indices, and the FAO in fact takes from that partly in order to construct what they then tell the world is either prepare for higher prices or make higher prices, or prepare your food stocks accordingly, or take away from your public food supply this much in order for you to tide over what we see is in a crisis. Now you can imagine for a country like India, and the size and depth and breadth and reach of our PDS, our public distribution system. So I began to think carefully about what this entire structure of one agency has on our PDS and our food prices, especially our food staples. Because as you know, we maintain our own food prices indices, so many of them. This is done not only by the Ministry of Agriculture, but it's also done independently by state departments of agriculture, because it depends entirely on the state mix of what reaches the hearths and the food processing centers. So and this really illustrates the kind of total dissonance between what is a global index and what in fact happens locally, for which we have our own systems of monitoring. So by around 2000, when I got into the Ministry of Agriculture program in 2009, which in fact had to do with traditional cropping systems, we were already seeing through the state agriculture university systems, which are part of the extension, what we call the agricultural extension. We were already seeing pressure to adopt particular cereals, or rather a particular mix of cereals, wherever anything is grown. And the looking at the long-term impact of such a such pressure, it would lead inevitably to a narrowing of the agrobiodiversity uh, in any cropping system. What does that mean? That means that if normally you were growing 6 or 7 different kinds of cereals and 6 or 7 different kinds of lentils and a basket of about 20 uh, different vegetables, that would narrow down to about 2 of each as far for the cereals and the legumes, and about 4 or 5 of the vegetables. Uh, and this was not altogether apparent, but it was the inevitable conclusion of doing things according to what the FAO agronomists were advising the government. Uh, so our question first was, all right, this is a multilateral organization. It is a UN organization. It looks at the world as a single place, as a single unit with a few um, let's say, deviations from the norm. And therefore, it advises accordingly. The question for us is how much of that advice you should take and how much you should reject. And we have enough grounds to tell you that you should reject almost all of it. Of course, this wasn't done. And the result is that by 2010 already, we started seeing the appearance in the agricultural policy, if you can call it that, but it came out in many different ways, not a coherent policy, but together it formed a definite drive towards this, what I can only call a bizarre idea of one district, one agricultural crop export. And to me, that was more than, I mean, more than just bizarre, because how can you treat a district which has itself, an Indian district is a large territory. How can you treat a particular district as being the engine of producing one particular kind of grain or cereal or cash crop or or horticultural produce? It's absurd. And what are the impacts of doing so on the food security of the smallest unit, which is the smallholder farmer, uh, who has to always leave aside some of his plot for his own consumption? So these, not that they haven't been studied, they've been studied very closely, but the conclusions of those studies never made it back into policy. Rather, the policy was geared, or rather, policy was drafted according to what the UN agency was dictating, and very much less, if only in token, according to the practices that were coming from the ground. And this became, I think, one of the early red flags for me personally, when I saw this complete dichotomy between what was happening at the at the level of central planning and what needed to happen at the level of taluka marketing. And that, together with various other instances, not least the ones in UNESCO, which I faced directly, having had to travel to many of the countries in Asia Pacific in order to deliver training, give advice, and so on. In the area of intangible cultural heritage, which is a difficult term, I prefer to just call it traditional knowledge, because for us, the connection between culture and knowledge is is close enough not to warrant any kind of distinction of terminology. Um, and the I think the single most insight that I was able to slowly come across, or rather come to, during my time in UNESCO, was the insistence upon a country which became a UNESCO signatory that it must describe its knowledge systems to UNESCO in a language which almost always was the case, in a language that it was not native, that was not native to it, uh, in a format that was an administrative format only, uh, to which then the government of the day would then endorse as this being the official description, and because of which the individual knowledge communities, as we call them, what does that mean? That means that suppose you have, let's say, you pick up any of our handicrafts, let's say Madhubani. So we have Madhubani described not the way Madhubani artists and practitioners would describe it, but the way administrators, researchers, anthropologists, ethnologists would describe it in a format that has come to you from a international overarching bureaucratic organization in a language that is not yours, uh, to a specified length which prevents you from expressing yourself, uh, and written for an audience who is completely removed from you. So when I began to see this, and in fact, I was part of this and had to do it as my missions over and over again, I began to see, just as I told you with the FAO case, the dichotomy between what is imagined by one of the agencies of this supranational governance, what is imagined of the world, about the world, and how the world is to report to it through the agency of national ministry or state department, and what in fact exists about the description and the veneration of a knowledge system on the ground by its practitioners. And, you know, I would say at some point that that division, or rather that dissonance, became too difficult for me personally to deal with on a mission-to-mission basis. And that led to a lot of friction over the years, or I would say over the latter years, between me and the UNESCO Secretariat. And eventually I decided not to have anything to do with it anymore, which I think was the only avenue available. So, but again, you know, this is a very potted, an extremely telegraphic sort of narration of my experience with UNESCO, which is the agency with which I spent the most time. I have, of course, written about it at length, and you'll find it here and there on the internet. But the implication really of having what is very fondly and very admiringly called a global governance system is, I think, what, to me, what I showed you in one of those slides earlier: transparency, accountability, integrity, and independent monitoring and evaluation. Those are completely missing. It's bad enough that anyway we have to struggle for these at the local level or at the provincial and state level in order to have them enforced. But at this level, we know that it is there and we know how to enforce them. You cannot say the same for that supranational level. Who do you go to? Do you go to a UN representative office? Do you go to a UN regional office, the one for Asia and Bangkok? How do you even reach there? How will they even respond? You have no standing in their eyes because they deal only with administrations and country governance governments. As an individual, you have no ingress whatsoever. So accountability and transparency then becomes something that doesn't even appear on the negotiating table between you, an individual who is a de facto recipient of the thinking that comes from a UN agency and the thinking that comes from the multilateral system. And the originators of that program. Where are your representatives? Here, for better or for worse, you have ward members, you have MLAs, you have sarpanches and panchayats, you have municipal councils, and so on. We have a system where we can go to for complaints and for redressal. Where do you go to for complaints and redressal in the UN and multilateral system? As an individual, you cannot. And this really is the problem, because the individual whether it's a developing country, developed country, or whatever kind of country that there exists these categories for, as an individual, you become just part of a collective statistic, nothing more. And this really to me, it belies all the high-sounding rhetoric that comes out of the General Assembly and all the associated bodies. Well, the purpose of my giving this lecture, and once again, my thanks to Indus University for hosting it and giving me the space in which to speak about this. The purpose is to forewarn and forearm young Indians, or even not so young Indians, about what this system is. Because certainly it looks very attractive, and monetarily it is attractive. It looks attractive also because it gives you a standing that is above a state or national standing. Suddenly you are a global ambassador or an international civil servant. But beware, because these are systems that are not meant to, in fact, deliver all the ideas that are supposed to be redolent with nobility and the pursuit of higher civilization. And with that, I'll end. And if I'm completely running over time, I'm sorry about that. But if anybody has any questions, then please do fire them away.
Thank you for that lecture, sir. Whatever time we may have or spilt over, I think it was worth it, absolutely. The first question that we've gotten is that how do these multilateral institutions show symptoms of neocolonialism?
They only show those symptoms. They don't show any other symptoms. I mean, look, a multilateral system, look, the UN and the multilateral, the UN, of course, came about immediately after the end of the Second World War. Let's have world peace and let's keep it that way, and so on. The multilateral system, as I mentioned, I think just about 5 minutes ago, does not see you as an individual, does not see your culture, does not see your tradition, does not see your social institutions, does not see your religious institutions, sees nothing. It sees you as a uncomfortable and usually undesirable part of the territory and the administration that it wants to control. And that's about it. So is it neo-colonial? No, it's entirely colonial.
Another question is since you mentioned that this is a lecture that aims to forearm youngsters, something that becomes very aspirational to youngsters is when they see, youth stars being promoted by the UN and different multilateral institutions like Greta Thunberg or Vika Tivu or Lisipriya Kanjugam from India as well. So, how exactly are we able to sort of strip the veneer and see what it is for really, what this kind of promotion is for really?
Um, I have to say, from the point of view of a younger person, let's say somebody who's between 20 and 30, I would find it very hard to understand how to strip the veneer, because the tools that the UN agencies and the UN system employs are very sophisticated indeed. I know for a fact that a large part of every agency's budget goes to, let's say, what we would call the PR, the public relations companies, all of which have invested hugely in how to design and broadcast messages on social media, which they know that every young person consumes. So a significant budget of every single UN agency and the UN system as a whole, right from the Secretary General's office to the UN General Assembly, to the UN Security Council, to the UN ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Commission, uh, is uh, is in fact deployed to make the UN look good and to polish the halo that sits around its head. So that becomes very hard. That becomes very difficult to, in fact, see beyond and see behind, unless you are, as a young person, you are willing and able to do some reading and research, and engage in discussion with people like yourself, and to address these, start asking uncomfortable questions and start expecting uncomfortable answers.
Sir, another question would be, let's take the World Cup for an example. Now that you have, countries like the USA and Canada coming in as well. Um, there is also, the statements of IMF. Again, that goes to another level. IMF is always very appreciative of India and its economic strategies. Is this a way to sort of confuse the international Indian diaspora as to what exactly their stand should be in terms of identity? Because I mean, why is there a certain readiness for other countries to have, which basically are only having Indian players play for them, in places like on platforms like the World Cup? Why is that being seen now? Is something that makes me it makes me want to know why exactly that is happening now, out of all the times.
Okay, I'm trying to understand, because you said two or three different things there. Yes, I know. I kind of know that the US cricket team is full of Indians. Um, Ojasvi, the thing is that spectator sport has long been a vector for messaging. Uh, and this, of course, this started in the US and Europe probably around the same time, maybe a little later in the US than in Europe. So Europe football is a big sport. And so the European Football League and the national leagues, they were all set up long, long ago. In fact, pre-war, we had, by pre-war, I mean the war is the Second World War. So they predated the Second World War. So, you know, spectator football and the gathering of football spectators and the creation of teams and team owners all were quickly understood and seen to be part of the apparatus that would be able to generate and maintain a kind of pseudo-nationalism. By pseudo-nationalism means that you are in a frame where, because your focus is on the winning or losing of, or the winning rather, of the team that you support, you are amenable to all sorts of messages being beamed at you if they are in the right language. And this is what has been exploited by ruling forces in Europe, and then in USA. In USA, of course, it became basketball and baseball. And soon enough in India, of course, it became cricket. So we saw the conversion of long drawn out but enjoyable test cricket, 5-day test cricket, into 1-day cricket way back when World Series cricket was started by a television channel magnate from Australia. His name was Kerry Packer. And that happened a long time ago. So that sort of medium for providing these kind of messages came in a while ago, even to our part of the world. And of course, with 1-day cricket then becoming also T20 cricket, you doubled the impact. So the sponsors of ODIs and T20 games know exactly what the sort of social dynamics are of the audiences they are speaking to, whether in the stadiums or on their TV screens or on their mobile screens. So you can push in all kinds of messages there because the recipient is already in a state of a sort of vulnerable euphoria. Um, and I mean, if IMF wants to start supporting cricket teams, then I mean, I would say it better shut down cricket to save it then.
Uh, Sir, I read this really interesting editorial on the Times of India, written by a former diplomat by the name of Ajay Bisaria, and I'd like to read out a certain excerpt of it. He talks about how basically now the international policy for Modi's new government should be peacemaking. And he talks about how UNSC has traditionally borne the responsibility for global peacemaking, but its credibility has waned given active involvement in current global contests of the P5. Their veto systems or their vetostomies, as he calls it, have resolutions that directly censure China, Russia, or even Israel. India has sent peacekeepers under the UN flag, but these efforts kick in once of conflict is stabilized when negotiated peace is to be maintained. Effective peacemaking will thus require the involvement of other stakeholders with vested interests in global stability. So it basically talks about how UNSC has become defunct in peacemaking entirely. So then exactly how will our peacekeeping strategy now take place that now that we are not going to have that as an intermediary anymore?
Ojasvi, I am not as familiar as you probably think I am with the UNSC. I pay attention to it. I pay attention to it only to the extent that I see it conforming to what I've just described about the UN system as a whole. But nevertheless, about the UNSC being a peacekeeping and peace maintaining organization, I think, in fact, it does the opposite. In fact, it foments far more conflict than it even attempts to resolve. And part of the reason is the way, the, the ridiculous way that it is set up. You have the permanent members and you have a rotating group of other members, and there's no end to the the sort of quid pro quo geopolitics that happens there, and I must emphasize this, there as it happens in every single other UN assembly, whether it's the General Assembly or in the General Assemblies of the individual UN agencies, which are already also very large. Uh, the General Assembly of UNICEF, for example, has representatives from all the countries, 193 countries. And so in all the major agencies, UNICEF, FAO, WHO, UNDP, UNESCO, etc., you have the representatives of the signatory countries, which is usually almost 95% of all countries. And so you have the geopolitical blocks in each and every one of them. And the UNSC is no different. So what you will see in the UNSC, which we imagine as being directed towards the resolution of conflict and the maintaining of peace, in fact, represents the geopolitical struggles that are being played out in every single one of these assemblies, including the UN General Assembly. So I think expecting anything different from the UNSC is fantasy. I don't care how many ex-diplomats say so, I know so.
I think that brings us to the end of the question and answer session, sir. Thank you very much for this lecture. It's been increasingly insightful of what exactly we are to expect of the next set of sessions that we will definitely have with you, because this is just the first of many.
Okay.
Um, it's been insightful, like I said, and like you said, it's been very condensed. So we'll make sure we can, narrow down the subjects a
Yeah.
little more so that we can give you the freedom to wander a little more into your experiences, because those are very rich learnings that we would like to give out to our viewers as well. Thank you very much again, sir, and we wish to have many such talks with you. Namaste.
Thanks for having me. Namaste.